G'day, my name is Corin Edwards. I'm a designer. My work history is kind of like starting off in a bunch of startups. Then for about 7 years, I worked for the State Library of Queensland as their interaction designer. Then did a few stints in sort of like proper government. Did the Department of Science, Information Technology and Innovation. And also some time at Housing and Public Works, doing essentially like simplification exercises with government departments and the web services that they support to varying degrees of success. And now I'm working on app design at Expedia Group. And as a part of that, sounds like we've got someone that's not muted in the background there, but I'll carry on anyway. All right, so haptic design. So one of the things that I've been working on at Expedia Group is looking into how we can integrate haptics into our app. And so this is a little accumulation of some of the research that I've done around that in the past few months, I suppose. So here we go. Oh. All right, so first of all, what are haptics? This is the Wikipedia definition. Haptic technology, also known as kinesthetic communication or 3D touch, refers to any technology that can create an experience of touch by applying forces, vibrations, or motions to the user. So the example I'm showing here is the Nintendo Switch. It has controllers which have devices in them called haptic drivers, and those are able to convey that feeling of sensation. Haptic drivers sort of give you like a few kind of variables that you can move around. And in doing so, you can do something like this, which is to give the impression of someone who is holding a glass and has an ice cube rattling around inside. So there's certain kind of ways that we can design or to a certain degree draw haptics to make them give the impression of being something in the real world. But there's also, you know, we can use them to sort of like convey more abstract concepts as well. The Nintendo Switch, I think, is like a really nice sort of example of these things. But another one that's really good that a lot of people might be familiar with is the trackpad in a MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air, where for a long time that was a physical clicky clacking mechanical device where you would sort of press it in and it would sort of register your clicks. But that was then replaced with a haptic driver, which gives the impression of what is otherwise like a still object clicking in, which, you know, gives you some sort of savings around wear and tear and stuff like that. But if anyone has ever had the very odd sensation of placing their hand on one of these haptic trackpads when a laptop doesn't have power, you get this really ghostly experience of what felt like a mechanical thing suddenly just actually turning out to be a solid surface that doesn't move at all. And it's like quite a weird sensation. Let me carry on. So why haptics? I kind of break this up into two areas. The first is immersion. And so probably, again, the Nintendo Switch is probably a good example of this. This GIF that I'm showing here is the Oculus Quest, and it's showing its like first steps or its tutorial introduction. I think we've got someone's unmuted themselves again.
Things you say no to in life that possibly do.
No, can anyone else hear that, or is it just me? Anyway, I'll do my best to carry on. All right, so where were we? All right, so this little gift here is showing, the Oculus Quest, which is a virtual reality headset that comes with some haptic controllers. And the haptic controllers are used in this particular sort of introduction to like allow people to figure out how to use the device. And what it really does here is like it gives you a very tiny little sensation as someone picks up one of these virtual cubes and places them back down again on a table. I might just actually turn down my volume a bit so I can hear a little bit less of that. And so this is kind of used for like very immersive experiences. And to be perfectly honest, with the day-to-day work that I do, I don't really have sort of like much to do with stuff like this. So what I'm more concerned with is the utility of haptics. So haptics are really useful. It's sort of like helping make up for a trade-off that we've made with mobile devices. So there's kind of like this trade-off that we've made because mechanical controls provide like state and feedback in a really good way. Like if you touch a switch or you touch a dial, you've got like a really good idea of what state that dial is in. And if you're moving it, you get instant feedback through touch. And as a result, you can use things without having to look directly at them. But the trade-off is that those mechanical controls need holes to work. And sealed devices without holes are more durable. They don't get dust or water inside. And so as a result, we've kind of moved away from having these mechanical controls so that we can have these durable sealed devices, and haptics can be a really good way to make up for that trade-off. I'm going to talk a little bit about using haptics now, and I'm going to talk about sort of like three main areas. One is supplemental validation. Next is just some general design principles to look at and how we actually control haptics. And finally is salt and pepper. So first of all, supplemental validation. This is just a quick quote from the Nielsen Group that I think is probably like a nice way to kind of like describe what's going on here. I apologize for just reading out what's on the screen, but one way to provide feedback on mobile for drag and drop is to use haptics. A subtle haptic bump can indicate that an object has been grabbed, and another one can indicate that an object has been dragged over a drop zone. So I think that's a really nice sort of like summing up of a real practical way that haptics can help a user interface rather than necessarily embellish it. So this is another GIF that sort of like demonstrates this in action. This is showing the long press on the virtual spacebar to activate cursor mode on iOS. This is a way that haptics can be used to sort of like give voice to the intentionality of a user interface and to let you know that the right thing has happened. So what's happening in this example is that a user is writing themselves an email. They're concentrating on what they're writing in the email and, you know, sort of like going around and editing it, sorry. And the iPhone like has this function where like instead of having to sort of like tap around almost haphazardly with big thumbs and fingers like I have, you can press down on the spacebar to activate this cursor mode. So it goes into a different mode and lets you use that the gestures at the bottom in what would have been the keyboard before to move around the cursor. Now, there's sort of like a few things going on here. You've kind of got the point of view where you, the top end of the screen is where like a user has their focus. But at the bottom end of the screen, you have this like quite complex gesture that's being used to switch between two different modes. And so haptics can go a long way to let you know that the right thing has happened. And so as a user sort of like holds down in that spacebar area, and if they hold there for the right amount of time, they will get this nice little positive haptic bump that will let them know that they're in this like cursor mode now. And that way they don't have to like constantly be switching their attention from the top of the screen down to the bottom of the screen, which can be super useful. This is another example of this happening. So this is the Airbnb app from iOS. And I'm going to try and do something now, which I'm going to have to rely on the gods of Bluetooth to work for me, but I'm going to have to take my headphones out and see if it works. Kind of hard to, it's kind of hard to convey haptics through Zoom. This is something that you really want to sort of like touch and feel to get the sensation for. So what I've done is I've taken a video of this app working, and I've tried to get the camera as close as I can so that it will record the vibrations that are happening on the desk. But you'll also have to listen to my dog barking in the background. I apologize. So I'm just going to turn the volume up there, so hopefully this will work. So
quite subtle, but as we loop through, when a user touches on this number 24 in this calendar, they'll get a little bit of haptic feedback. So I don't know if anyone could hear that, but hopefully they could. I'll leave that running for a little bit. But essentially what is happening here is, again, we're kind of playing with signal to noise ratio. So we have system messages that increase cognitive load in a complex user interface. A calendar is a very complex user interface, especially when it's squished into the small pane of glass of a telephone. And so haptics are a great way to confirm like what you've done right or what you've done wrong. So in this case, we have sorry, I'm just gonna have to let my dog out. He's having a little bit of a cry, my apologies. So again, what's happening here is this property on Airbnb has a 3-night minimum. When the user presses the number 24, they're pressing sort of like within the bounds of that 3-night minimum. So they're going to get essentially what is an error state. As you can see, that error state is like rising up as a little sort of little popover from below where the user's attention is. And so what Airbnb have done instead is that they've applied this negative leaning haptic to reinforce the fact that something has gone wrong and they need to touch something else in this instance. And so what's really great about haptics in this case is that you're able to give really responsive feedback to a thing that a user is doing without cluttering the visual field by putting sort of like X's or big red marks directly over the top of this calendar, which is already, you know, as I mentioned, a quite complex UI for a user to make their way through. All right, so next I'm just going to talk about a few design principles. First of all, make haptics optional. And that kind of leads on from the supplemental validation idea. But for the most part, I'm sure there are experiences which you could use that would rely purely on haptics. But for the most part, haptics should be considered in the same way that sound is almost, in that it should be something that can accompany and provide supplemental validation to an action that happens like on the raster screen. But always consider them to be used as optionally, because people do have accessibility settings which can let them turn haptics off. And of course, certain users won't experience those haptics if they're using some kind of different device to sort of, or some kind of accessible mode to using experience. Another basic design principle is to mirror audio metaphors, and we'll go into this a little bit more, but essentially the sharp stabbing noise of like say someone sort of like smashing a violin, you will get a roughly sort of analogous response to that noise as you will from like a similar sharp and like very heavy sensation that you create through a haptic driver. And sort of on the other side, if you make a haptic that is sort of like soft and gentle, then you will get like an equally sort of like positive leaning sensation out of that. Next is to be purposeful and sparing. And finally is just to maintain battery life. So those two kind of go hand in hand. First of all, you don't want to sort of like dominate an experience with too many haptics. You want haptics to be used when they sort of make sense and when they help convey purpose or like a state that is happening within your app or your experience. And sort of the flip side to that is, you know, these haptic drivers, they do take electricity. So if you're using them too often, you will be draining your user's battery as well. So next is to talk a little bit about controlling haptics. This is a diagram from Apple's HIG with their article about haptics. And I think this does probably a pretty good job of conveying the two sort of like variables that you have that you can use to like paint a picture with haptics. So the first one is sharpness and the second one is intensity. And although that may seem like it's not really too many elements to be working with, when you combine sharpness and intensity in the same way that you maybe combine brightness with hue, then you can use all of those different ranges to create quite complicated pictures. But I prefer this metaphor to sort of like describe what happens when you're communicating with haptics. And that is that you kind of have this scale that's got sharp things like the quills on a cactus on one end, and very soft things like the fluffy fur of a puppy on the other end. And using haptics, especially when you do things like combining them with sound and visuals, you can really convey like something that is sharp versus something that is soft, and a whole sort of like little world of things that happen in between those two areas. This is a diagram from Justin Baker, who has a really great post about haptic design that is sort of like one of the first places where I found when I started looking into this. And I think this does a really good job of conveying how that idea of having something that's sharp and something that's soft and something that's sort of like sitting in between can actually be used to convey quite a wide sense of communication. So on the left here, we have this thing that is, again, using this idea of mirroring audio metaphors. Sorry. When we create a ascending tone, and we take something that is starts out quite soft, and something that's starts soft but is also not very hard, and then you sort of increase the hardness and decrease the softness of it. When you sort of do that in an ascending motion, you get something that feels positive, because you kind of get something that is roughly analogous to when you go and pat a little puppy's head and it's got real soft fur. And so you start out touching this very, very soft fur on the outside, and as you sort of like push a little bit closer, you get like a little bit more resistance back. And so you get this like roughly like positive sensation from, touching a fluffy little puppy. The next one he shows is neutral, which is essentially a flat sensation. So in this case, we're just running two haptic sensations that are of completely sort of like equal softness and hardness, softness and hardness. But this gives you the sensation of touching something that is solid. So essentially like, like touching a table or something like that. It's inert, it's neutral, it's not communicating anything negative or positive. And then on the right here, you have this descending tone. So when you start out at a place that's sharp and then you go to something that's soft, you kind of mirror then the sensation of if you were to touch something that was either hot or sharp. So if you were to touch the quill on the end of a cactus, you would get something that is very hard and sharp, which would sort of like run into your finger, and then you would pull your finger away. And so you would get this sensation of having something very hard and sharp in your finger and then moving it away very quickly. And so that kind of mirrors this like descending tone, as it were. And so using those like three different sort of ends of the spectrum, or those two ends of the spectrum and the bit in the middle, you can create something that is positive, something that is neutral, and something that is negative. So in this case, success, neutral, and warning or error. So I might again try just using this sound from my Mac to actually convey something here. This is just the haptics page on Apple's Human Interface Guidelines. And this is kind of like showing roughly the same thing, but hopefully you can actually sort of like hear this to a certain degree, because when you sort of match these sensations with sound and image, it kind of like sort of amplifies these sensations. So here is a positive success haptic. And here is a negative warning haptic. And so you can kind of see how those very really, all you're really doing is you're just like rearranging those levels of sharpness and hardness. And one is ascending and one is descending, and it's conveying like quite a nice sense of either a negative or a positive action. I'll just jump back to my presentation. All right, so lastly is salt and pepper. And this is probably, you know, salt and pepper is probably like a sibling to immersion. So my partner is a dance teacher and she does a lot of choreography, and salt and pepper is a term that they use to describe something that elevates a piece of like performative dance from something that's, you know, like conveying some like emotion or idea to really making something that kind of like pushes through and, you know, like actually sort of elicits a reaction from an audience. So synchronized actions simply are delightful. And so when we choreograph haptics and visuals and sound together, we're really able to sort of like push the experience of an app a little bit further than we would otherwise. Haptics bring a sense of completeness to a mobile UI because mobile devices now have haptics, and in certain parts of a mobile experience, just purely at the OS level, you will experience haptics. As a result, if you don't have haptics, they kind of stand out a little bit. Kind of like what I was saying before about if you touch a MacBook trackpad when the power's off, like the fact that the haptic isn't there sort of like sticks out a bit like a sore thumb. Choreography also reflects a real investment and care in production. And so if you've ever heard of the aesthetic usability effect, there is this sense that users get from using a system that if that system has had sort of like care put into it, I apologize for my dogs there, care put into it and is if they feel that it has like an aesthetic advantage, then they will feel that that aesthetic is probably mirrored in the utility of the app as well. And so essentially, if an app is beautiful, then people will give it like a little bit more leeway as far as, you know, the reviews that they give it in the App Store and so forth. But obviously, as we were sort of mentioning before, be careful not to overseason. If we like put too many haptics into something and we sort of like put over that tipping point, then we will, you know, you will run the risk of making an app that is like, you know, like buzzing all the time and is just irritating. So much like with sound or motion or visuals, you know, use sparingly and purposefully, and, you know, that'll probably be the best way to do it. So just a couple of places where you can sort of find more stuff about haptics. These are on the left. Haptic, a guide to haptics, is an app which costs money. It's very cheap, but it essentially is like a little demo of some of the stuff that I've been talking about. So, you know, like showing the differences between success states and failure states and warnings and things like that, just using little haptic examples. So it can be a good way to kind of like get across this stuff. That's for iOS. On the right, I'm showing a little screenshot of a project library called haptics.js. And this won't work in Safari, unfortunately, but it will work in Android. And it's got like, it gives you the ability to actually sort of like run code in there as well. So you can kind of like edit around these haptics and like make your own little versions of them. So that might be a good place to sort of experiment, but just be aware that it won't run on an iOS device. The only thing I will say is that it's kind of like you do have to feel these things on device to be able to get them right. So figuring out some way to do that, you can always crack open Xcode and produce an app with some haptics in it. There's also another app that I have come across recently. I haven't quite been able to get this to work, so I won't include a link to it because I don't know if I can actually recommend it as such, but just know that it's out there. There's a thing called Haptics with an X. And it's kind of a combination of a Mac app and an iPhone app and an online service where you can kind of like share things. I haven't quite got it working, so I won't exactly recommend it, but you know, it's out there if you're super keen. The other thing that I will mention is that Tin, who's one of the developers that I work with at Expedia, he is working on some of the hackathon work that we did around haptics earlier in the year. He's working on going through the process of open sourcing some of that hackathon work and putting it on the App Store. That's a thing that we haven't really done at Expedia before. So we're just trying to sort of navigate exactly how to sort of like get that out and get the licenses done. So that won't be out anytime soon, but that is a pretty cool app that he created that does let you kind of like edit haptics on your phone and kind of like export them. But anyway, that's not out yet, so I can, if anyone's interested, I can follow up later with that. And finally, just to finish off, this is I look, as I was sort of like researching this stuff, one of the things that I did find was this great project, which is obviously still in very early stages. And essentially, this is called Sticky Touch, a tactile display with changeable adhesive distribution. This is, you know, like obviously an academic project, but it's one where a material is being used whose like sort of like tackiness is changed when you apply heat to it. So in this example, which shows Windows Explorer, and it's being projected onto this surface, and the surface has different heat applied to it underneath certain items in this listing. And as a result, when the user sort of like pushes their finger down, the thing becomes tacky and sort of like sticks their finger there. So there's no practical use for that just now, but I thought it was interesting anyway. And one last thing that I will mention is for anyone who's interested in the accessibility side of this, this is a very sort of early stage working draft of a new accessibility spec, much like WCAG or something similar. It's called ZOR, which sounds like a cool robot dinosaur, but what it actually stands for is Mixed Reality Accessibility User Requirements. And it's really describing sort of an accessibility spec for virtual reality, augmented reality, and sort of some other technologies in that sort of dome. But that includes like some references to like how haptics can be used in a sort of like responsible manner in a like accessibility context as well. And I think that's probably about all of it. So yeah. Maybe we've got some questions, or maybe not. I'll stop sharing.
No, we do. We definitely do, Corin. So thanks very much for that. That's really, really good. Actually, really interesting that you mentioned the accessibility, because we actually have an accessibility talk next month, next week.
Oh, cool.
So some of those same things may come up. So that was really great. We do have a few questions. The first one I'll rattle off. Is there research on how combining visual tremor with haptic makes both seem more real?
I'm not aware of any specific research that covers that. It's real might not necessarily be the word to describe it, but it's certainly something that when used in the right way, it can make something more engaging. And I guess to a certain degree, that's really just my personal experience. But there's definitely work in the area around that sort of stuff. Most of my research has been around sort of more utilitarian stuff than immersion stuff, and how this stuff is sort of like used in more sort of practical user interfaces. But I recently tried the Oculus Quest virtual reality system, or the Oculus Quest 2, and that introduction, the sort of like opening tutorial is one of the most sort of engaging things that I think I've ever experienced. It's a really like incredible sensation, which sort of logically, I know that all that is really happening is that we're getting sort of very slight sort of like touches and slight vibrations in that haptic. But when it's combined with like a sound and a visual of me picking something up, it really does a great job of tricking my brain. Even though I know that it's tricking it, it's still tricking it in such a way that like it really does feel like you are sort of like interacting with a real object in a very virtual world. So. Yeah,
fantastic. Next question. Do you think we'll have haptic specialists as part of mobile teams in the future?
I have been thinking a lot about that as I've been sort of like going through this stuff. I think we probably will. I think that as the other example that I haven't had a chance to try yet of a haptic device that is like setting the world on fire right now is the PlayStation 5's controller. And its use of haptics is able to like really sort of like accurately convey the sensation of feeling like you are moving your hand through grass, or that you are like feeling sort of droplets of water. And I think that there's like there's a real sweet spot in between sort of a technology job and a craft and sort of like creative job of making these things either feel realistic and immersive, or making them feel very sort of like functional and utilitarian. And I think that much like a sort of like graphic designer, I think that a haptic designer will be like I feel like that's a role that probably does already exist in some places, like maybe game studios or something like that. But my sense is that this, now that I've paid attention to it, feels like such an important part of a mobile experience that I would be very surprised if people didn't like specialize directly down into this.
Yeah, brilliant. Next question. Are there any cultural differences in haptics, or anyone researching that, like gestures that might have cultural sensitivity?
That's a great question. I don't have a really good answer for that. We do a lot of localization work at Expedia, and as we sort of start pushing this stuff out into sort of like various experiences within our app, I'm sure that we will come across that if it does exist. Part of me thinks that like maybe there's a certain universality to like the sensation of touch. But I think that's a really good question, and I wouldn't be surprised if that instinct of mine turns out to be wrong. But yeah, right. I can't tell you for sure.
Well, that actually leads into our last question, which is whether or not haptic design is currently used in the Expedia app and how it's being received by users.
So it's not in there yet. I don't work on the Expedia app itself. Not the Expedia public facing app. I work on Partner Central, which is one of our sort of like B2B apps. And we are about to use it. We use the sort of like default haptics that come with both iOS and Android. So that's things like check marks and stuff like that. When you like switch a toggle, you get like a little tiny haptic bump by default. And so we take advantage of that stuff that's already in there. But what we're about to start using it for is like essentially when we have a sheet that pops up to show some kind of like promotion or new item or like new feature that's coming into the app. We're going to use some of this research into like positive and negative haptics to try and sort of like reinforce those ideas. So got a little sheet that pops up and a little sort of like character that jumps up with it. And so to make this sheet engaging, because it's something that can be dismissed, there will be like a little haptic like positive bump that goes along with this little sort of like character jumping up and bouncing and appearing. The other place that we're looking to use it as well is when we do like our authentication. We're looking at applying it to, we have sort of like this authentication process where you go through and you either authenticate or you don't. And so we're looking at putting in like a positive haptic and a negative haptic depending on what state you get in, because that sort of authentication state takes over the whole screen. So we really like the idea of like reinforcing the negative and the positive using it.
Okay, great.
One of that
I will actually ask. No, that's brilliant. I will actually ask you one more, actually, which is a question of my own. Is there or any kind of best practices in terms of determining prior to building where it might be appropriate and where it's not? Or is it one of those things where it probably should make its way into every aspect of the design, but just at various different levels?
Yeah, look, I think it's good to be sparing to begin with. That's definitely the strategy that we're going to take, where we're going to sort of like drop it into little places here and there and build up how often it's used. And we figure that'll at least give us the ability to sort of like pull back if we find out that we're going too far and we get any kind of feedback that people are getting sort of like annoyed by these haptics. We would hope that for those people who do have like leave the haptic stuff on by default, that we wouldn't want to sort of like push them into like trying to turn that off and moving it. Like absolving all the other apps from being able to use it as well. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking to it. I think that positive, neutral, and negative are like three sort of like very simple states that we can use to sort of like accompany with these pieces of supplemental validation. But I think the other thing and the other place, which is probably like a good spot to start thinking about using things, is when a user is focusing on one part of the screen and another part of the screen is where they're told whether or not something has worked or something hasn't worked. They've got like a success or a failure. Haptics are a good place to apply there, because that way, you know, a user doesn't have to shift focus from what they're doing. They can just use that haptic to get that understanding of the state of the system.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks very much. And look, we really appreciate the talk. It's something very different for us to what we had before. Everyone, the video and links and slides we made available on the on our socials as well, so you can follow up with those, and I'll make sure I put links through to Corin's LinkedIn and Twitter. I think I saw one as well, and find out where we can follow you. So thanks very much, Corin. Really appreciate it.
Cool, fantastic. Thanks, guys.